The autumn breeze gently rustled the fallen leaves as James pushed open the door to his favorite coffee shop. He needed a break from organizing new arrivals at his bookstore, and the promise of their seasonal pumpkin blend was too tempting to resist. At 28, he had finally achieved his dream of owning a small but cozy bookshop in the heart of town, a place where literature enthusiasts could lose themselves among carefully curated shelves. As he waited in line, James glanced around the cafe. That's when he saw her, sitting alone by the window, her silver hair catching the afternoon light. Even after 7 years, he recognized Eleanor Wilson immediately. She had been his literature professor in college, the one whose passionate lectures about classic romance novels had ignited his own love for literature. Now in her 60s, she still had that same thoughtful expression as she wrote in a leather-bound notebook. James hesitated. Would she even remember him? After ordering his coffee, curiosity won over uncertainty, and he approached her table. "Professor Wilson?" he said softly. Eleanor looked up, confusion briefly crossing her face before her eyes lit with recognition. James Bennet. What a wonderful surprise. She closed her notebook and gestured to the empty chair across from her. "Please join me." As James sat down, he noticed how time had been kind to Eleanor. Fine lines framed her blue eyes, but they still held the same intensity that had commanded attention in her classroom years ago. "It's been too long," Eleanor said, her voice warm with genuine pleasure. "Tell me, what have you been doing since graduation?" James smiled and told her about opening his bookstore last year, how he'd saved for years while working at publishing houses, learning the business from all angles. Eleanor listened intently, asking thoughtful questions about his collection and clientele. "I always knew you were meant for books," she said, a hint of pride in her voice. "Your final paper on love and sacrifice in 19th century literature was one of the finest I've ever read." James felt a rush of pleasure at her praise. "Coming from you, that means everything. Your class changed my life." A comfortable silence fell between them as they sipped their coffee. James noticed how Eleanor kept glancing at her notebook, her fingers tapping lightly against its worn cover. "And you?" he finally asked. "Are you still teaching?" Eleanor shook her head. "I retired last spring. 40 years of teaching was enough." She hesitated, then added, "Now I'm trying to figure out what comes next." There was something vulnerable in her admission that surprised James. He had always seen her as confident and self-assured, the woman who could silence a lecture hall of rowdy students with just a raised eyebrow. "Actually," Eleanor continued, her voice dropping slightly, "I've been meaning to reach out to former students who showed real promise." She met his gaze directly. "Particularly you." James felt a curious flutter in his chest. "Me? Why's that?" Eleanor took a deep breath. "I have a request. It might sound unusual, especially given our history as teacher and student, but—" Her phone rang suddenly, cutting through the moment. Eleanor glanced at the screen and sighed. "I'm sorry, I need to take this." "It's my daughter." She answered the call, speaking in low tones while James tried not to listen. When she hung up, Eleanor gathered her things. "I have to go. Family emergency." She hesitated, then asked, "Your bookstore, where is it located?" James told her the address, and Eleanor nodded. "I'll come by tomorrow afternoon, if that's all right. What I want to ask you, it deserves more than a rushed conversation." As James watched her leave, he wondered what request his former professor could possibly have for him after all these years. The curiosity followed him back to his bookstore, where he found himself glancing at the door throughout the afternoon, already anticipating tomorrow's visit. The next day, James found himself straightening books that were already perfectly aligned. He had opened the shop an hour early, unable to sleep from wondering about Eleanor's mysterious request. The morning passed slowly with few customers, giving him too much time to imagine various scenarios. Around 2 in the afternoon, the little bell above the door chimed. James looked up from the register to see Eleanor walking in, more dressed up than she had been at the coffee shop. She wore a deep blue dress that brought out her eyes with a simple pearl necklace resting against her collarbone. She carried a worn leather satchel that looked heavy with books or papers. "Welcome to Bookmark Haven," James said with a smile, coming around the counter. "I was hoping you'd still come." Eleanor looked around the small shop with appreciative eyes. "This place is exactly as I imagined it would be." So perfectly you. She ran her fingers along the spines of books on a nearby shelf. You've organized by theme rather than strict alphabetical order. Bold choice. James laughed. Some customers find it frustrating, but most enjoy discovering unexpected connections. Just like life, Eleanor said softly. She turned to face him fully. Is there somewhere we could talk privately? James nodded and led her to the back of the store, where he had created a small reading nook, with 2 comfortable armchairs separated by a small table. After flipping the sign on the door to back in 30 minutes and locking up, he joined her. Would you like some tea? He offered. No, thank you. I've been rehearsing what to say all morning, and I'd rather just say it before I lose my nerve. Eleanor placed her satchel on the floor beside her chair and leaned forward slightly. James, I want you to help me write a novel. Of all the things James had imagined, this wasn't one of them. A novel. Eleanor nodded, color rising in her cheeks. For 40 years I've taught literature, analyzed the great works, criticized and praised the efforts of others. But I've never created anything of my own. Her hands twisted in her lap. I'm 60 years old and I suddenly realized I might die without ever trying. The vulnerability in her voice touched something in James. He'd never seen this side of his confident professor before. Last year I was diagnosed with a heart condition, she continued. Nothing immediately life-threatening, but enough to make me think about what I might regret leaving undone. She smiled ruefully. Writing a novel has always been my secret dream. Why me? James asked. There must be people with more experience, other writers or professors. Because you understand both the technical and emotional aspects of literature, she interrupted. Your writing always had heart, James, and because, she hesitated, I trust you not to laugh at an old woman's romantic notions. Romantic notions? James repeated, intrigued. Eleanor reached into her satchel and pulled out a thick notebook. I want to write a love story, not the kind young people write about fleeting passion, but one about deeper connection, about finding someone who sees you completely, perhaps when it's unexpected, perhaps when it seems too late. James felt a strange tightness in his chest as she spoke. There was something almost confessional in her tone. I have ideas, fragments, but I need a partner in this. Her eyes met his, nervous but determined. We could meet weekly. I'd compensate you for your time, of course. No, James said quickly, and seeing her face fall, he added, I mean, no compensation needed. I'd be honored to help. He smiled. Actually, I think it sounds fascinating. Relief washed over Eleanor's face. Really? You aren't just being kind to your old professor. James shook his head, surprised by how genuine his interest was. Not at all. I think we could create something meaningful together. He reached for the notebook she still held. May I? Their fingers brushed as she handed it to him, and for a brief moment, something electric passed between them, a recognition of stepping into unknown territory together. James opened the notebook, ready to begin their unexpected journey, while Eleanor watched him with eyes that held both hope and something else he couldn't quite name. 3 weeks into their collaboration, James found himself looking forward to Wednesdays more than any other day. Eleanor would arrive at his bookstore just before closing time, and they would retreat to the small apartment above the shop where they could work without interruption. Tonight, as rain pattered against the windows, they sat across from each other at his kitchen table. Pages of notes and drafts were spread between them, along with 2 empty wine glasses and the remains of a simple dinner James had prepared. I think our main character is too passive, Eleanor said, tapping her pen against a paragraph they had written together. She waits for life to happen to her, rather than making choices. James nodded, noticing how the soft lamp light caught the silver in Eleanor's hair. Maybe that's her journey, learning to take action before it's too late. Before it's too late, Eleanor repeated softly. Yes, exactly. She looked up at him with eyes that seemed to hold a question. Do you ever worry about that, James? About waiting too long for the things you really want? The question felt weighted with something beyond their novel. James took a sip from his water glass, considering his answer. I used to think I had all the time in the world. Now, at 28, I'm starting to understand how quickly years pass. Eleanor smiled, a touch of sadness in it. Wait until you're 60. Decades dissolve like sugar in hot tea. She looked down at their work. Sometimes I think about all the paths I didn't take, the chances I didn't seize. James found himself leaning closer, drawn by her rare moment of personal revelation. Like what? Oh, many things. She waved her hand dismissively, but then paused. Love, mostly. I married young to a good man who became a stranger over time. We divorced when my daughter was in college. Her fingers traced patterns on the wooden table. I never remarried, focused on my career, my students. And now the novel, James added. Eleanor nodded. And now the novel. Their eyes met and held for a moment longer than usual before she looked away. They worked for another hour, the conversation moving between the fictional world they were creating and occasional glimpses into their real lives. James found himself sharing thoughts he rarely voiced to others, his fears about the bookstore's financial stability, his occasional loneliness in a town where most friends had moved away. You know what's strange? He said as they finished revising a dialogue scene. I feel like I can tell you things I don't tell anyone else. Eleanor's hand paused over the page. I feel the same way. Perhaps because we're already creating something intimate together. She gestured to their manuscript. Fiction allows for a certain kind of truth. As she spoke, James noticed a strand of her hair had fallen across her cheek. Without thinking, he reached out and gently tucked it behind her ear. The moment his fingers brushed her skin, he realized what he'd done. A gesture too familiar, too tender for their arrangement. I'm sorry, he said quickly, pulling his hand back. That was. It's fine, Eleanor interrupted, her voice steady though color had risen to her cheeks. She gathered her papers, not meeting his eyes. It's getting late. I should go. James walked her to the door, an awkward tension between them that hadn't existed before. As she put on her coat, Eleanor finally looked at him directly. James, I want to be clear about something. I value our collaboration immensely, and I don't want anything to complicate it. Her voice was gentle but firm. I'm old enough to be your mother. I know that, James said, feeling strangely defensive. I wasn't suggesting. Of course not, she said quickly. I just wanted to make sure we understand each other. She hesitated at the threshold. Same time next week. After she left, James stood by the window watching her walk through the rain to her car. He tried to name the confused feeling in his chest. Embarrassment at his inappropriate gesture, certainly, but also a nagging sense that Eleanor's quick departure had less to do with propriety and more to do with something neither of them was ready to acknowledge. The following Wednesday arrived with an awkwardness that hung between James and Eleanor like a heavy curtain. They worked with polite distance, careful not to let their hands touch when passing papers back and forth. Their conversation stayed strictly focused on the novel, missing the warm personal exchanges that had become the heart of their meetings. I think we should introduce a complication for our characters, Eleanor suggested, her voice overly professional, something that forces them to confront their feelings. James nodded, not looking up from his notes. Makes sense. Just as the session was concluding earlier than usual, the bell above the shop door jingled. James had forgotten to lock up. Hello? A female voice called from downstairs. Up here, Kate, James answered, recognizing his friend's voice. Moments later, a woman about James's age with bright red hair appeared at the top of the stairs. She stopped short when she saw Eleanor. Oh, sorry, didn't realize you had company, Kate said, her curious eyes moving between them. It's fine, James said quickly. Kate, this is Eleanor Wilson, my former professor. We're working on a writing project together. Eleanor, this is Kate Miller, my friend from college. Eleanor stood and offered her hand with a warm smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Lovely to meet you. Professor Wilson, the famous lit professor. Kate's eyes widened. James used to talk about your class all the time. Eleanor glanced at James with surprise. Did he? Kate nodded enthusiastically. Oh yeah, it was always Professor Wilson says this and Professor Wilson thinks that. I swear he had the biggest. Kate, James interrupted sharply. Did you need something? Kate grinned, enjoying his discomfort. Just came to remind you about dinner tomorrow. The whole gang is meeting at Tony's at 7. She turned to Eleanor. You should join us. I'm sure everyone would love to meet James's new collaborator. The pause before collaborator carried an insinuation that made James want to disappear. Eleanor, however, handled it with graceful poise. That's kind, but I already have plans with my daughter tomorrow evening, perhaps another time. After Kate left with a too innocent smile and a wink at James, the atmosphere in the room felt even more strained. "I should go," Eleanor said, gathering her things. "About Kate," James began, "she has a tendency to." "You don't owe me any explanations, James." Eleanor's voice was gentle but distant. "Your social life is your own business." As she reached for her coat, her notebook slipped from her hands, scattering loose pages across the floor. They both knelt to gather them, and James noticed pages he hadn't seen before, personal notes rather than material for their novel. Before he could stop himself, he read a line. "I find myself thinking of him at odd moments, remembering the way his eyes light up when." Eleanor snatched the page from his view, her face flushed. "That's private." "I'm sorry," James said, a strange hope rising in his chest. "Eleanor." "Please don't," she said quietly. "This can't happen, James. Whatever this is between us, it would only lead to complications neither of us needs." "Because of our age difference?" Eleanor nodded, not meeting his eyes. "Among other reasons, you should be with someone like Kate, young, vibrant, with her whole life ahead of her." "Kate is just a friend," James insisted. "And I don't care about the age gap." "You should," Eleanor said firmly, standing up straight, "and so should I." Later that night, James couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the words he'd glimpsed in Eleanor's private notes. Was she writing about him or their fictional characters? The lines between their created world and reality seemed to be blurring. His phone buzzed with a text message from Kate. "So, your professor is pretty hot for 60. No wonder you had a crush on her in college. Is something going on there?" James stared at the message for a long time before replying. "It's complicated." As soon as he sent it, he realized just how true those words were. What had begun as a simple collaboration had evolved into something neither of them had anticipated, something that both frightened and exhilarated him in equal measure. For the first time since they began working together, Eleanor missed their Wednesday meeting. A brief text explained she was feeling unwell. James spent the evening staring at blank pages, unable to write a single word without her. The following Wednesday, she arrived exactly on time, looking somewhat pale but composed. They worked with careful politeness, the creative spark between them dimmed to embers. "This isn't working," James finally said after an hour of stilted conversation. "The writing is suffering because we're both pretending." Eleanor set down her pen. "Pretending what, exactly?" "That there's nothing between us beyond this book." The words felt dangerous once spoken aloud. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, her gaze was steady. "We need to finish the scene where our characters finally confront their feelings. Perhaps that will help us move forward." It was the closest she'd come to acknowledging the tension between them. James nodded, and they turned to their work with renewed focus. The scene they were writing was pivotal. Their two main characters, after months of denying their attraction, finally confronting their feelings during a thunderstorm that forced them to seek shelter together. As they wrote, the dialogue became increasingly charged, each line seeming to carry double meanings. "I've tried to keep my distance," James read aloud as they worked, voicing the male character's lines. "But every time I'm with you, I feel more alive than I have in years." Eleanor's fingers trembled slightly as she wrote the female character's response. She says, "This is impossible. There are too many reasons why we shouldn't feel this way." "Give me one good reason," James continued, his eyes locked on Eleanor's face rather than the page. Eleanor looked up, the line between character and creator blurring. "Because I'm afraid," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Neither of them was pretending to read from their notes now. "Of what?" James asked gently. "Of everything." Eleanor stood and moved to the window, her back to him. "Of how people would see us. Of how quickly this could fall apart. Of how badly it would hurt when it does." James rose and stood behind her, close but not touching. "You're assuming it would end badly." Eleanor turned to face him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "James, be realistic. I'm 60 years old. What could I possibly offer you beyond a few complicated years?" "Understanding," he answered without hesitation. "Wisdom. Conversation that never grows dull. A connection I've never felt with anyone else." He took a careful step closer. "I don't care what people think, Eleanor." "You should," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Your friends already suspect something. My daughter would be horrified." Let me ask you something, James said. In our novel, when our characters finally admit their feelings, do they regret it? Do they wish they had continued pretending? Eleanor shook her head slowly. No. Despite everything, they find a kind of freedom in the truth. Then why are we denying ourselves the same? For a long moment, Eleanor said nothing. Then, with a gentleness that made his heart ache, she reached up and touched his face, because fiction allows for happier endings than real life often provides. Before he could respond, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his in a kiss so soft it felt almost like a goodbye. James stood frozen, afraid to move, to break whatever spell had allowed her this momentary courage. When she pulled back, her eyes were filled with a complex mixture of emotions: desire, fear, resolve. I need time to think, she said quietly. This isn't a simple decision for me. Take all the time you need, James replied, though it took all his restraint not to pull her back into his arms. I'll be here. Eleanor gathered her things, pausing at the door. Our characters, she said in the midst of their storm, we never finished writing what happens next. James smiled softly. That's because their story is still being written, just like ours. After she left, James returned to their manuscript, rereading the scene they had created together. The words seemed to pulse with life, with truth. Whatever happened next between them, he knew their novel had crossed some threshold tonight, from mere fiction into something much more real. A week passed with no word from Eleanor. Then, too, James tried calling, but his calls went straight to voicemail. He sent a few texts, each more concerned than the last, but received no response. The novel sat untouched on his desk, their characters frozen in time like insects in amber. On the third Wednesday without her, just as he was closing the shop, the bell above the door jingled. James looked up, hope flaring in his chest, but it was Eleanor's daughter who walked in. He recognized her immediately from the photo Eleanor kept in her wallet, tall like her mother, but with dark hair and a stern expression that made her look older than her 30-something years. You must be James, she said, her tone cool and appraising. Yes, he replied, extending his hand, and you're Eleanor's daughter. Olivia, she supplied, giving his hand a brief shake. I need to talk to you about my mother. The formality in her voice sent a chill through him. Is she all right? I haven't heard from her in weeks. Olivia's expression softened slightly. She's in the hospital. Her heart condition, there were complications. The world seemed to tilt beneath James's feet. Which hospital? St. Mary's. Olivia watched his reaction carefully. She didn't want me to tell you. Why not? She said something about not wanting to burden you, that it was better this way. Olivia sighed. But I've been reading parts of your novel, the one you've been writing together, and I think she's making a mistake by shutting you out. James grabbed his coat without hesitation. I need to see her. That's why I'm here, Olivia said. But before we go, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest. Her eyes, so like her mother's, held his firmly. What exactly are your intentions toward my mother? The bluntness of the question took James by surprise, but he answered without hesitation. I care about her. Deeply, more than I've cared about anyone. She's 60 years old, Olivia said, as if he might have somehow forgotten this fact. I'm aware of her age. And you're what? 28? 29? 28, James confirmed. Does the age gap bother you? Olivia considered this. What bothers me is the possibility that my mother might get hurt. She's been through enough in her life. I would never intentionally hurt her. Intentionally being the key word, Olivia noted. But what happens when you want children, or when she needs care that a partner 32 years younger isn't prepared to give? These were questions James had asked himself during the silent weeks without Eleanor. I don't have all the answers, he admitted, but I know I want the chance to figure them out with her. Something in his voice must have convinced Olivia. She's in room 312, she said. Visiting hours end at 8. I'll drive you. The hospital corridor seemed endless as James followed Olivia. When they reached room 312, she stopped. I'll give you some privacy, she said, surprising him with her thoughtfulness. James found Eleanor sitting up in bed, looking smaller and more fragile than he remembered, but her eyes were bright and alert. She gasped when she saw him. James, what are you? Her eyes moved past him to the doorway. Olivia brought you, didn't she? Don't be angry with her, James said, moving to Eleanor's side. Why didn't you tell me you were ill? Eleanor looked down at her hands. I thought it would be easier this way. A clean break. Easier for whom? James sat carefully on the edge of the bed. These weeks without you have been torture. For me too, she admitted quietly. But James, my heart, she gestured to the monitors beside her bed. It's not just a metaphorical problem anymore. James reached for her hand. All the more reason not to waste whatever time we have. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. That's precisely why I stayed away. I can't ask you to commit to someone with such an uncertain future. You're not asking, James said. I'm choosing. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a stack of pages. I brought our novel. Our characters are still waiting in that storm, wondering what happens next. A small smile touched Eleanor's lips. And what do you think happens next? James leaned closer, his voice low and certain. They choose love, Eleanor. Despite the risks, despite what anyone else might think. They choose each other. Eleanor studied his face for a long moment. And would you make the same choice? Knowing everything you now know? Instead of answering with words, James leaned forward and kissed her, gently but with unmistakable certainty. Against his lips, he felt her smile. 6 months later, James stood in the corner of a crowded bookshop. Not his own, but a larger one downtown that had agreed to host their book launch. The room hummed with conversation and anticipation. He watched as Eleanor signed another copy, her silver hair elegantly styled, her blue dress bringing out the color of her eyes. She looks beautiful tonight, Olivia said, appearing beside him with 2 glasses of champagne. She handed one to James. Their relationship had evolved into something like friendship over the past months. She always does, James replied, unable to take his eyes off Eleanor. The months of her recovery had been both challenging and precious. Days spent working on their novel from her hospital room, then her home, gradually building both the story and their life together. Eleanor looked up and caught his eye across the room. Even now, that simple connection made his heart race. She smiled and beckoned him over. Ladies and gentlemen, she said as James joined her at the signing table, I'd like to introduce my co-author and partner, without whom this book would never have existed. The small crowd applauded, most unaware of the complex journey behind the simple description of partner. Their novel, Unexpected Chapters, had found a publisher almost immediately, a love story between 2 people who found each other at unexpected times in their lives. Critics had praised its emotional honesty and unconventional romance. Would you like to read the final passage? Eleanor asked James, handing him their book. James opened to the last page, his voice steady as he read words they had written together. They understood finally that love doesn't always arrive according to schedule, or in the package one expects. Sometimes it comes late, bringing complicated gifts and difficult questions, but the beauty of finding it at all makes every challenge worthwhile. As he closed the book, James noticed Kate standing near the back of the room, giving him a thumbs up. His friends had been surprised at first, some skeptical, but seeing him and Eleanor together had gradually changed their minds. Later that evening, after the last guests had departed and they stood alone in the quiet bookshop, Eleanor wrapped her arms around James's waist. Did you ever imagine that night in the coffee shop where this would lead? She asked. Not in my wildest dreams, James admitted, kissing the top of her head. But I wouldn't change a single chapter. Eleanor looked up at him, her eyes serious. Even the hospital chapters, the worried looks from your friends, the whispers when we walked together. Especially those parts, James said firmly. They're all part of our story. That night, they walked hand in hand to the small apartment they now shared above James's bookstore. It wasn't always easy. Eleanor's health required ongoing care, and the age gap occasionally presented challenges they had to navigate together, but the depth of their connection made each obstacle surmountable. As they prepared for bed, Eleanor sat at her desk, opening her notebook. I've been thinking about our next project, she said, perhaps something different this time. James smiled. A year ago, he would never have imagined this life, sharing his days and nights with his former professor, building both a relationship and a creative partnership that enriched them both. Whatever we write next, he said, sitting beside her, it has a lot to live up to. Eleanor touched his face gently. You know, when I made that request all those months ago, I was only thinking of fulfilling one dream before it was too late. I never expected to find another dream entirely. James turned his head to kiss her palm. That's the thing about unexpected requests, he said softly. You never know where they might lead. Outside their window, snow began to fall, the first of the season. Eleanor closed her notebook and took James's hand. We should go to bed, she said. We have plenty of time to start new chapters tomorrow. And as they held each other close that night, James reflected on how a simple encounter in a coffee shop had transformed both their lives, proving that some of the most beautiful stories begin when we least expect them, and that love, in its wisdom, rarely follows convention but always finds its way.